opposing marijuana legalization. And I think it also speaks a lot to probably Trump's interpersonal relationships. I mean, it might have a lot to do with Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. They don't get along too well, you might have heard. And DeSantis is taking a lot of political capital on beating Amendment 3, which is the marijuana legalization initiative in Florida, sponsored almost entirely by Tallahassee-based multi-state operator TrueLive. I think they alone have shelled out $72 million and counting. It's already the most expensive marijuana legalization initiative in history. And yeah, Trump's been had been really quiet on it for most of the summer. And then over Labor Day weekend, sort of put out, this is all on his, we obviously all spend a lot of time on Truth Social. But anyway, it's on his private, his own social media network. Yeah, over Labor Day weekend, sort of put out this sort of like vague statement, just saying like, yeah, nobody should be arrested for this. It's going to pass anyway. And if it does, the legislature should also make it stronger by banning public consumption, which, I think is kind of like a nod to maybe his, old school sort of, conservative New Yorker vibe there. But yeah, and then a week later on Sunday night, after DeSantis had spent some time campaigning against the initiative at churches in Florida and things like this, yeah, Trump came out and said, yeah, I'm going to vote for it. People shouldn't go to jail again. So there you have it, folks. Donald Trump has endorsed marijuana legalization, and he will be, I guess, the first presidential candidate to also vote for a legalization initiative, a feat that he can accomplish by being a Florida voter.
Yeah.
So there you are.
It seems like a lot, but the way you made it sound, you're downplaying it. Jeremy, what you've also talked about it sort of in the newsletter and on this program. Yeah. Is it monumental or is it mini news?
Somewhere in the middle. And I don't want to equivocate that answer too much. It's absolutely not mini news that the Republican candidate for president is endorsing cannabis reform. I mean, say that sentence 10 years ago, you'd never believe it was true. At the same time, to what we've discussed, he's basically coming straight into line with the mainstream Democratic position. It doesn't really change much on an actual policy basis which candidate wins at this point, which is an interesting question of itself. But it's not like Trump's position on cannabis is some earth-shattering, novel approach. It's basically just what the industry and Democrats, mainstream Democrats, I should say, not necessarily progressives, have been asking for years. I think one interesting wrinkle, and Jay, you and I have discussed this a little bit, but the fact that there's so little daylight between the two candidates on this issue, I think is the most interesting aspect of it, right? There's less daylight between Harris and Trump on Schedule 3, on banking protection, the Safe Banking Act, than there is with some members of their own party. And that's a pretty interesting political dynamic, that I think is being under discussed right now, excuse me.
Yeah. And Chris, to that point, I mean, you did mention Ron DeSantis, who's the Republican governor of Florida, is on the opposite side of the Republican presidential candidate, Donald Trump. They have a long personal history, which is longstanding. But there was also rumblings, at least from some folks on the sort of pro-reform side in Congress, saying it's great that Trump is there, but he needs to bring some senators with him to actually get reform done. And like, to your mind, does this do anything to do that? He's not been a super strong mover of votes in Congress necessarily.
I mean, they only need a couple more to get to 60. I mean, so the whole problem with congressional reform, and I guess there's a couple things to break down there. Yeah, there's also in the message I should have mentioned, he did voice support for moving cannabis to Schedule 3, which is the biggest thing to happen federally anyway, since the Controlled Substances Act. So yeah, putting that aside for a second, to the congressional bit, he also voiced support for safer banking reform, some of the stuff that's been bottled up in Congress now for as long as it's been there. I mean, this year hasn't even, or this cycle rather, in this session of Congress, it hasn't even received any love in the House, which is a new wrinkle. But in the Senate anyway, because of how cloture works, because of how filibuster rules work, you need 60 votes to end debate on something and really move it forward. And that's where safe banking has been kind of stuck now. after its historic Senate committee hearing about a year ago, Chuck Schumer has received some opprobrium from the industry, fairly or unfairly, for never calling it for a vote. I mean, the reason why you heard he never did is because it didn't have 60 votes. Why call something for a vote if you know it's going to lose? And yeah, having Trump on board should, in theory anyway, get some of this support out there. I mean, there's been lots of talk that Tommy Tuberville from Alabama is a fan and would vote for it. But then you have the Mitch McConnell and sort of like your more mainstream-ish Republicans didn't seem to have any love for it whatsoever. So yeah, I mean, you would think that having Trump on board would get your more right-wing senators on board. Although, it seems like there are more Trump acolytes in the House, like the House Freedom Caucus. And the ironic thing there is they've always been real big supporters of stuff like banking reform. So yeah, I mean, should this increase the whip count to over 60? It should. But, you can make the argument that they should have had that support anyway, because really all this does is solidify banking access. I think a lot of people recognize that the big marijuana companies are all banked. It should help the small and medium companies. It should decrease the cost of their access to a banking. But yeah, I mean, it should help. Like it can't not, Yep.
We had Tyler Berline from Safe Harbor Financial on earlier in the week, and he sort of talked very directly, like, would it be great for the industry? Of course, but there are many more banks now than there were 10 years ago that are banking the industry. It is a lot about access to capital for reasonable terms, and that may change. But his suggestion was that he wouldn't expect immediately bigger banks getting involved, or necessarily the credit card companies opening up their rails, at least the name, the big brand credit card companies opening their rails to payment. So it is an important step, but it's not the be all end all of sort of cannabis.
No, exactly. And I think that you saw this even last summer. Some companies or some lobbying groups in Congress were trying to add uplisting to U.S.-based exchanges to safe banking. There was already sort of a recognition that, this would have been nice a couple years ago, but the list of needs and wants has only increased. And I mean, again, like you put it, it'd be nice. Way more is needed. And I mean, I think that maybe that's a good seg into rescheduling. I think there was a lot of worry that were Trump to be reelected or be elected to a second non-consecutive term, that he'd undo stuff like the Biden administration marijuana rescheduling process, which I don't know. I always thought it was a possibility, but I was kind of skeptical. I didn't really see what the value add for him for any politician to do that would be. And maybe, Trump put those fears to rest with his post on Sunday night. But I mean, the other thing that I just want to say, I guess, is just the constant with like Donald Trump. I mean, he says a lot of stuff. I mean, I watched the debate on Tuesday. I imagine you guys did. And there's more time spent talking about who or who isn't eating pets than there was about cannabis reform. So, I mean, take that, mean it as for what you will. I mean, that's just the nature of the guy that we're dealing with, I suppose.
Yeah. And if he doesn't have a cannabis plan, maybe he's got the concept of a cannabis reform plan.
But on a serious note, if he does anything on cannabis before healthcare, I just think that's not good governance, but it's bad politics too. I mean, we were sort of talking about this before we started recording. If you look at any voter's list of priorities, I mean, cannabis is just not in the top. It's not in the top 15 for most people. I mean, there are apparently some single issue marijuana voters out there. I think it was the New York Times was doing something about its undecided voters. And I think there was a single issue. It might have been them. It was someone else. So there are single issue marijuana voters out there. I don't think there's very many. Yeah. And I mean, you have to deal with stuff like healthcare and immigration and the border. And just the big thing that's hitting everybody is the affordability crisis. You got to deal with all that before really you can, I think anyway, you can pick up a lot of votes with marijuana reform.
That's a good segue, Chris. You didn't even know this, but that is a good segue because I know that there are some number of single issue cannabis legalization voters. In Minnesota, particularly, those single issue voters actually started their own parties and pushed the DFL in Minnesota actually to pass legalization, and the Governor Walz was part of it as well. But it actually did drive change. They didn't win elections, but they did alter the dynamic enough to get legalization done. And I bring that up because another piece that you wrote this week was about the traditional advocacy groups, the ones, some based in DC, but we're actually pushing for state reforms well before now, and got things on the ballot in Colorado and other places, and ran those campaigns, or at least made them happen, are not necessarily the ones that are doing Florida, for example, right?
Right.
Talk a little bit about that, because I thought that was an interesting story. Of course, they're still involved, but aren't necessarily the ones on the forefront.
Yeah, right. So the trend that we've been seeing for a couple of years now is these traditional, you could call them nonprofit advocacy groups. The big ones are Drug Policy Alliance, Marijuana Policy Project, and then New Approach. A decade ago, if you were running a ballot initiative, you were getting money from one of those three sources. And I think over the past 4 or 5 years, but it's been really pronounced in the past, let's say 2 or 3, there's been a real passing of the torch from these philanthropist funded organizations to what you could call industry lobbies. And I think that it's a progression, or sort of a maturation, that a lot of people were expecting. That as soon as there was an industry that was making money, that it would be able to sort of, walk on its own and achieve whatever policy directives it was looking for, be it in DC or at the state level. And that's not always true. And in this cycle in particular, Marijuana Policy Project is the main force behind a legalization initiative in South Dakota. But what's interesting about the South Dakota measure is that there's no provision for retail sales in the two. And maybe this is, I think, speaks to the phenomenon we're talking about. Yeah, in Florida and in North Dakota, 2 states where there is a legalization initiative that does include provisions for setting up regulated retail sales. Yeah, it's the industry is bankrolling the entirety of it. I mean, and the big one, of course, is Florida, where it's obviously a very populous state, more than 20 million people. It's, other than Texas, it's the most populous state to yet legalize adult use cannabis. Well, obviously, Texas, nothing but hemp, but that's a whole other pickle.
Different show. Yeah, we'll get there.
Very different show. Yeah, exactly. You see it in Florida. It's a sort of maybe like the maximalist view, where you have one multi-state operator, Tallahassee-based TrueLive, contributing $72 million and counting. And we still have another 2 months, a little bit less than 2 months before the election. So, it's already the most expensive legalization initiative in history. Not really something that, a philanthropist might want to pay for anyway. But in North Dakota, where things are a little bit less hyped, I guess you could say, it's just, it's sparsely populated and things like this. Yeah, it's just industry funding it there too. And it's not really 100% clear why there's a reluctance maybe on the part of some of these campaigns to get the traditional advocates into the fold. It could be that they have competing priorities. That's something that NPP anyway has denied. They're saying, no, like, we support it. We support both of these initiatives. Like, they're good for us. But yeah, so you're seeing the two things happen at the same time. I do think a lot of these like philanthropic dollars have sort of moved on to other things like psychedelic legalization. But yeah, the industry is just, I guess, in some cases big enough to do this by itself.
Yeah. Jeremy, is that your take too, that this was, for a long time, was a grassroots movement for sure, spearheaded in a lot of part by the organizations Chris was talking about, but also now there's grass tops, let's call them, right? There are real corporate interests involved that didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's sort of a maturation, and that seems like a normal progression.
Yeah, 2 things. Look, like, I fully subscribe to Chris's take that, MPP or the DPA aren't spending $72 million to get Amendment 3 passed in Florida. That money just doesn't exist, and that has to come from the industry. So I think fully aligned there. And I think the second point, we alluded to this very briefly in a newsletter this week, but the idea, I think, of regulatory capture is becoming more and more real in the cannabis industry. And that's not to say that it's my value judgment on what the legislation looks like. But, reading Trump's Truth Social statement, where we're all spending our Sunday nights hanging out, it really is like a laundry list of what the industry has asked for. And especially, you see this percolate on social media. There's a lot of very right-leaning members of the industry who are outspoken about that. And they've really got Trump's ear on exactly their political priorities that, I think whether or not, to Chris's point, that they're misaligned with what progressive grassroots movement want, it's certainly not everything that these progressive movements want. I think we're going to start to see that shift happen a little bit, and that the messaging that some of these groups have, they're going to say that like Amendment 3, frankly, does benefit True Leave. The jury is out on whether it's a monopoly creating mechanism that some of the anti-folks are saying it is. But, these are certainly policies and regulations that will benefit incumbents. And the more incumbents are able to spend on that process, the more, they're going to have an entrenched position that they want to protect. But at the same time, like to sort of give my value judgment now, I would say that these things are pretty common sense and boilerplate legislation. Like passing the Safe Banking Act, yes, there are quibbles with it, moving ahead of criminal justice reform. I hear that argument, but it is good for workers in the industry. It is good for companies. Reclassifying cannabis to Schedule 3 is less than ideal compared to decriminalization, but it is good for the industry and it is good for consumers. It's good for everyone. It's good policy. And so, while I think that they're able to tweak the regulations and the policies in ways that benefit them, that is not always a bad thing. Like there's not always a negative inclination to that. So I'll just sort of add that framework. And that's something that, I'm thinking about pretty seriously as I continue to cover this stuff.
I think, Chris, this lends itself, I think, even to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is let's take two examples, Florida and Ohio, where they are, both Republican governors for sure, but also are taking an approach that is much more less focused on social equity, less focused on equity at all, right. Social justice measures. None of that is actually part of what Florida is doing, and certainly was not part of sort of the way Ohio went forward. However, it is certainly, it is part and parcel or a big chunk of how New York has approached it.
Right.
And New York, let's take New York as the example we want to talk about, because that one, I think observers of the industry have said that is actually what's held it up. There's been lawsuits, there's been challenges to social equity components for the card licensees. All of those things have added time for sure and lots of headaches. But this week, these are not my words, but has a corner been turned in New York, I guess is the question. Both of you are based in New York, but there has been a lot of happening outside of the sort of top of the presidential tickets around cannabis in New York. And I think a lot of it has changed for the better over the past months, but certainly came to a head this week. What are you watching from New York this week?
Yeah, I mean, sales are up. Like that, the retailers here in New York just had their first $20 million week, is my understanding, and they're up to, I think, more than around $430 million worth of sales for the year. They think they can double that for the rest of the year, so they're picking up a lot of momentum, and they're tying it to the big crackdown that launched this spring. The legislature not so much gave law enforcement powers, or just reminded them that, yeah, you guys can actually enforce the law if you want to. And that includes against unlicensed dispensaries. If someone's selling weed, it's still a crime. You can do stuff. And that's according to the state in New York, more than 1,000 unlicensed marijuana sellers in New York City alone have been shut down since May, which, depending on whose estimate you're looking at, maybe only 4,000 or 5,000 more to go. With a couple hundred more, and I mean, I'm kind of being facetious, but I mean, I just think anecdotally, just walking around, it does seem like, yeah, you see a lot of weed bodegas that are now closed. You see the unlicensed sellers, near Penn Station. There was a Weed World there. That one's shut down. Yeah, I mean, it really seems like that there was a crackdown. I mean, I think from a lot of sort of the social justice advocates would maybe have some complaints about, a new drug war and things like this. But yeah, there was all these unlicensed, untaxed places to buy cannabis in New York City and in New York State. Now there are fewer. And as a result, retailers are selling more weed. I mean, it's still a lot less. There's still a lot there's a long way yet to go, I think, to reach the potential that people were thinking about in New York State. But yeah, I mean, they may clear 850 million total in sales this year, and they may hit over $1 billion next year. And by law, the vast majority of these license holders are social equity license holders too. So it's taken a long time, but maybe it is like a trust the process deal.
Yeah. And Jeremy, you and I had a conversation with folks who had recently exited the OCM earlier in the year.
Yeah.
We were actually talking about just this. Like, yes, it may take some time, but there will be a time where we reach the full potential of a New York market that is $1 billion+ market, where we're doing, as Chris said, sort of the $20 million type weeks. Part of that is getting consumers back in to the legal framework. Part of it is opening up a new retail licenses, but that seems to be the case. At least that's the trajectory.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think in my own perspective on New York, I live here. I've covered the rollout of the legalization very closely. The long-term thesis remains intact, right? Like, this is New York. This will be a center of the cannabis industry, both culturally, branding-wise, finance-wise. Like, everything is here. It will be here. It's just happening very, very slowly. And I think the slowness is shaking, especially it's shaken a lot of investors' confidence. But some of the conflicts of interest, I think, were self-forced errors on the state government's part. And, look, like, I'm not a regulator. They have a very hard job. I don't want to throw stones from outside, but, I do want to say the stuff with Chicago Atlantic, the Social Equity Fund.
Yeah.
John Schroyer in Green Market Report wrote a great story about, how one social equity aligned dispensary is still untangling from their debts and obligations to that fund, and they had no other choice. And so I think that was, a self-forced error on the regulators' part, but they had few good choices at the same time. But all that being said, I think the long-term thesis is there. Like, I am certainly excited to live here and watch the industry evolve and continue covering cannabis here. It hasn't shaken that. I just wish things would move a little faster on that front.
Yeah, I think that is a fair, that is totally fair, and certainly fair for both of you, because you guys are presumably cannabis consumers in New York that want options, want products, want great brands, and want it to develop as rapidly as possible. So for your own self-interest, but certainly for the interest of the industry as well. And are you ready for the last segue? Because this is a good one. And because this is super topical, all of these things, everybody should head to MJBiz at the beginning of December for MJBizCon 2024.
Absolutely.
First weekend, pretty good segue.
Yes.
So because not only will these conversations, certainly what happened in Florida will be discussed, what is happening in New York will be discussed, but it'll also be the days after the ALJ, the Administrative Law Judge hearing around rescheduling on December 2nd in DC. So there'll be lots of conversation the first week in December about that. So everybody get your tickets, get your flights, get your hotel rooms. We'll put a link about how to do all of those things. As always, Jeremy, thank you. But also, Chris, thanks for your first run at Reporter's Notebook. We'll have you back lickety-splickety. But thanks for your insight. Thanks for your thoughts today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You got it. And everybody tune back in on Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern, I guess 7 a.m. Pacific. We have a check-in with LJ Dawson from the Outlaw Report in D.C. There is some challenging news out of D.C. where nobody seems to be able to get, they can get a license, but they can't find a location to actually grow, process, manufacture, or test cannabis. So we'll talk to her about that and the latest. But Chris, Jeremy, thanks so much. Have a good weekend.
Okay.
You too.
Bye.